Section 15, Part 1, Chapter 3, continued, of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This recording is in the public domain. He could now live with some tracts of land over which to exercise his authority, struggling again with the resistance of men and things. Besides, the vast proportions of the rooms of the castle were very tempting and bare of furniture. This opportunity for placing the overflow from his cellars plunged him again into buying. With this atmosphere of lordly gloom, the antiques would harmonize beautifully, without that cry of protest which they always seem to make when placed in contact with the glaring white walls of modern habitations. The historic residence required an endless outlay. On that account it had changed owners so many times. But he and the land understood each other beautifully. So, at the same time that he was filling the salons, he was going to begin farming and stock raising in the extensive parks, a reproduction in miniature of his enterprises in South America. The property ought to be made self-supporting. Not that he had any fear of the expenses, but he did not intend to lose money on the proposition. The acquisition of the castle brought Desnoyers a true friendship, the chief advantage in the transaction. He became acquainted with a neighbor, Senator Lacour, who twice had been minister of state and was now vegetating in the Senate, silent during its sessions, but restless and voluble in the corridors in order to maintain his influence. He was a prominent figure of the Republican nobility, an aristocrat of the new regime that had sprung from the agitations of the Revolution, just as the titled nobility had won their spurs in the Crusades. His great-grandfather had belonged to the Convention. His father had figured in the Republic of 1848. He, as the son of an exile who had died in banishment, had when very young marched behind the grandiloquent figure of Gambetta, and always spoke in glowing terms of the master, in the hope that some of his rays might be reflected on his disciple. His son Rene, a pupil of the Ecole Centrale, regarded his father as a rare old sport, laughing a little at his romantic and humanitarian republicanism. He, nevertheless, was counting much on that same official protection treasured by 4 generations of Lacours, dedicated to the service of the Republic, to assist him when he became an engineer. Don Marcelo, who used to look uneasily upon any new friendship, fearing a demand for a loan, gave himself up with enthusiasm to intimacy with this grand man. The personage admired riches and recognized, besides, a certain genius in this millionaire from the other side of the sea, accustomed to speaking of limitless pastures and immense herds. Their intercourse was more than the mere friendliness of a country neighborhood, and continued on after their return to Paris. Finally, Rene visited the home on the Avenida Victor Hugo as though it were his own. The only disappointments in Desnoyers' new life came from his children. Chichi irritated him because of the independence of her tastes. She did not like antiques, no matter how substantial and magnificent they might be, much preferring the frivolities of the latest fashion. She accepted all her father's gifts with great indifference. Before an exquisite blonde piece of lace, centuries old, picked up at auction, she made a wry face, saying, "I would much rather have had a new dress costing 300 francs." She and her brother were solidly opposed to everything old. Now that his daughter was already a woman, he had confided her absolutely to the care of Dona Luisa. But the former peoncito was not showing much respect for the advice and commands of the good-natured Creole. She had taken up roller skating with enthusiasm, regarding it as the most elegant of diversions. She would go every afternoon to the ice palace, Dona Luisa chaperoning her, although to do this she was obliged to give up accompanying her husband to his sales. Oh, the hours of deadly weariness before that frozen oval ring, watching the white bright circle of balancing human monkeys gliding by on runners to the sound of an organ. Her daughter would pass and repass before her tired eyes, rosy from the exercise. Spirals of hair escaped from her hat, streaming out behind, the folds of her skirt swinging above her skates. Handsome, athletic, and Amazonian, with the rude health of a child who, according to her father, had been weaned on beefsteaks. Finally, Dona Luisa rebelled against this troublesome vigilance, preferring to accompany her husband on his hunt for underpriced riches. Chichi went to the skating rink with one of the dark-skinned maids, passing the afternoons with her sporty friends of the New World. Together they ventilated their ideas under the glare of the easy life of Paris, freed from the scruples and conventions of their native land. They all thought themselves older than they were, delighting to discover in each other unsuspected charms. The change from the other hemisphere had altered their sense of values. Some were even writing verses in French, and Desnoyers became alarmed, giving free rein to his bad humor when Chichi of evenings would bring forth as aphorisms that which she and her friends had been discussing as a summary of their readings and observations. "Life is life, and one must live. I will marry the man I love, no matter who he may be." But the daughter's independence was as nothing compared to the worry which the other child gave the Desnoyers. Ay, that other one! Julio, upon arriving in Paris, had changed the bent of his aspirations. He no longer thought of becoming an engineer. He wished to become an artist. Don Marcelo objected in great consternation, but finally yielded. Let it be painting. The important thing was to have some regular profession. The father, while he considered property and wealth as sacred rights, felt that no one should enjoy them who had not worked to acquire them. Recalling his apprenticeship as a wood carver, he began to hope that the artistic instincts which poverty had extinguished in him were perhaps reappearing in his son. What if this lazy boy, this lively genius, hesitating before taking up his walk in life, should turn out to be a famous painter after all? So he agreed to all of Julio's caprices, the budding artist insisting that for his first efforts in drawing and coloring he needed a separate apartment where he could work with more freedom. His father, therefore, established him near his home, in the Rue de la Pompe, in the former studio of a well-known foreign painter. The workroom and its annexes were far too large for an amateur, but the owner had died, and Desnoyers improved the opportunity offered by the heirs, and bought at a remarkable bargain the entire plant, pictures, and furnishings. Dona Luisa at first visited the studio daily like a good mother, caring for the well-being of her son that he may work to better advantage. Taking off her gloves, she emptied the brass trays filled with cigar stubs and dusted the furniture powdered with the ashes fallen from the pipes. Julio's visitors, long-haired young men who spoke of things that she could not understand, seemed to her rather careless in their manners. Later on she also met there women, very lightly clad, and was received with scowls by her son. Wasn't his mother ever going to let him work in peace? So the poor lady, starting out in the morning toward the Rue de la Pompe, stopped midway and went instead to the church of Saint Honore d'Eylau. The father displayed more prudence. A man of his years could not expect to mingle with the chums of a young artist. In a few months' time, Julio passed entire weeks without going to sleep under the paternal roof. Finally, he installed himself permanently in his studio, occasionally making a flying trip home that his family might know that he was still in existence. Some mornings, Desnoyers would arrive at the Rue de la Pompe in order to ask a few questions of the concierge. It was 10 o'clock. The artist was sleeping. Upon returning at midday, he learned that the heavy sleep still continued. Soon after lunch, another visit to get better news. It was 2 o'clock. The young gentleman was just arising. So the father would retire, muttering stormily, "But when does this painter ever paint?" At first, Julio had tried to win renown with his brush, believing that it would prove an easy task. In true artist fashion, He collected his friends around him, South American boys with nothing to do but enjoy life, scattering money ostentatiously so that everybody might know of their generosity. With serene audacity, the young canvas dauber undertook to paint portraits. He loved good painting, distinctive painting, with the cloying sweetness of a romance that copied only the forms of women. He had money, a good studio. His father was standing behind him, ready to help. Why shouldn't he accomplish as much as many others who lacked his opportunities? So he began his work by coloring a canvas entitled "The Dance of the Hours," a mere pretext for copying pretty girls and selecting buxom models. Those he would sketch at a mad speed, filling in the outlines with blobs of multicolored paint. And up to this point all went well. Then he would begin to vacillate, remaining idle before the picture only to put it in the corner in hope of later inspiration. It was the same way with his various studies of feminine heads. Finding that he was never able to finish anything, he soon became resigned, like one who pants with fatigue before an obstacle, waiting for a providential interposition to save him. The important thing was to be a painter, even though he might not paint anything. This afforded him the opportunity, on the plea of lofty aestheticism, of sending out cards of invitation and asking light women to his studio. He lived during the night. Don Marcelo, upon investigating the artist's work, could not contain his indignation. Every morning the two Desnoyers were accustomed to greet the first hours of dawn, the father leaping from his bed, the son, on his way home to his studio, to throw himself upon his couch, not to wait till midday. The credulous Dona Luisa would invent the most absurd explanations to defend her son. Who could tell? Perhaps he had the habit of painting during the night, utilizing it for original work. Men resort to so many devilish things. Desnoyers knew very well what these nocturnal gusts of genius were amounting to: scandals in the restaurants of Montmartre, and scrimmages, many scrimmages. He and his gang, who believed that at 7 a full dress or tuxedo was indispensable, were like a band of Indians bringing to Paris the wild customs of the plains. Champagne always made them quarrelsome, so they broke and paid, but their generosities were almost invariably followed by a scuffle. No one could surpass Julio in the quick slap and the ready card. His father heard with a heavy heart the news brought him by some friends thinking to flatter his vanity. His son was always victorious in these gentlemanly encounters. He it was who always scratched the enemy's skin. The painter knew more about fencing than art. He was a champion with various weapons. He could box, and was even skilled in the favorite blows of the prize fighters of the slums. Useless as a drone and as dangerous too, fretted his father. And yet in the back of his troubled mind fluttered an irresistible satisfaction, an animal pride in the thought that this hair-brained terror was his own. For a while he thought that he had hit upon a way of withdrawing his son from such an existence. The relatives in Berlin had visited the Desnoyers in their castle of Villeblanche. With good-natured superiority, Karl von Hartrott had appreciated the rich and rather absurd accumulations of his brother-in-law. They were not bad. He admitted that they gave a certain cachet to the home in Paris and to the castle. They smacked of the possessions of titled nobility. But Germany, the comforts and luxuries in his country! He just wished his brother-in-law to admire the way he lived and the noble friendships that embellished his opulence. And so he insisted in his letters that the Desnoyers family should return their visit. This change of environment might tone Julio down a little. Perhaps his ambition might waken on seeing the diligence of his cousins, each with a career. The Frenchman had, besides, an underlying belief in the more corrupt influence of Paris as compared with the purity of the customs in patriarchal Germany. They were there 4 months. In a little while Desnoyers felt ready to retreat. Each to his own kind! He would never be able to understand such people. Exceedingly amiable, with an abject amiability and evident desire to please, but constantly blundering through a tactless desire to make their grandeur felt. The high toned friends of Hartrott emphasized their love for France, but it was the pious love that a weak and mischievous child inspires, needing protection. And they would accompany their affability with all manner of inopportune memories of the wars in which France had been conquered. Everything in Germany, a monument, a railroad station, a simple dining room device, instantly gave rise to glorious comparisons. In France you do not have this. Of course you never saw anything like this in America. Don Marcelo came away fatigued by so much condescension, and his wife and daughter refused to be convinced that the elegance of Berlin could be superior to Paris. Chichi, with audacious sacrilege, scandalized her cousins by declaring that she could not abide the corseted officers with immovable monocle who bowed to the women with such automatic rigidity, blending their gallantries with an air of superiority. End of section 15. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Part 1, Chapter 3, continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julio, guided by his cousins, was saturated in the virtuous atmosphere of Berlin. With the oldest, the sage, he had nothing to do. He was a poor creature devoted to his books, who patronized all the family with a protecting air. It was the others, the sub-lieutenants or military students, who proudly showed him the rounds of German joy. Julio was accordingly introduced to all the night restaurants, imitations of those in Paris, but on a much larger scale. The women, who in Paris might be counted by the dozens, appeared here in hundreds. The scandalous drunkenness here never came by chance, but always by design, as an indispensable part of the gaiety. All was grandiose, glittering, colossal. The libertines diverted themselves in platoons. The public got drunk in companies. The harlots presented themselves in regiments. He felt a sensation of disgust before these timid and servile females, accustomed to blows, who were so eagerly trying to reimburse themselves for the losses and exposures of their business. For him, it was impossible to celebrate with hoarse ha-has like his cousins. The discomfiture of these women when they realized that they had wasted so many hours without accomplishing more than abundant drinking, the gross obscenity, so public and noisy, like a parade of riches, was loathsome to Julio. "There is nothing like this in Paris," his cousins repeatedly exulted as they admired the stupendous salons, the hundreds of men and women in pairs, the thousands of tipplers. No, there certainly was nothing like that in Paris. He was sick of such boundless pretension. He seemed to be attending a fiesta of hungry mariners, anxious at one swoop to make amends for all former privations. Like his father, he longed to get away. It offended his aesthetic sense. Don Marcelo returned from this visit with melancholy resignation. Those people had undoubtedly made great strides. He was not such a blind patriot that he could not admit what was so evident. Within a few years they had transformed their country, and their industry was astonishing. But well, it was simply impossible to have anything to do with them. Each to his own, but may they never take a notion to envy their neighbor. Then he immediately repelled this last suspicion with the optimism of a businessman. They are going to be very rich, he thought. Their affairs are prospering, and he that is rich does not hunt quarrels. That war of which some crazy fools are always dreaming would be an impossible thing. Young Desnoyers, renewed his Parisian existence, living entirely in the studio, and going less and less to his father's home. Dona Luisa began to speak of a certain Argensola, a very learned young Spaniard, believing that his counsels might prove most helpful to Julio. She did not know exactly whether this new companion was friend, master, or servant. The studio habitues also had their doubts. The literary ones always spoke of Argensola as a painter. The painters recognized only his ability as a man of letters. He was among those who used to come up to the studio of winter afternoons, attracted by the ruddy glow of the stove and the wine secretly provided by the mother, holding forth authoritatively before the often renewed bottle and the box of cigars lying open on the table. One night he slept on the divan, as he had no regular quarters. After that first night he lived entirely in the studio. Julio soon discovered in him an admirable reflex of his own personality. He knew that Argensola had come third class from Madrid with 20 francs in his pocket in order to capture glory, to use his own words. Upon observing that the Spaniard was painting with as much difficulty as himself, with the same wooden and childish strokes which are so characteristic of the make-believe artists and pot boilers, the routine workers concerned themselves with color and other rank fads. Argensola was a psychological artist, a painter of souls, and his disciple felt astonished and almost displeased on learning what a comparatively simple thing it was to paint a soul. Upon a bloodless countenance, with a chin as sharp as a dagger, the gifted Spaniard would trace a pair of nearly round eyes, and at the center of each pupil he would aim a white brush stroke, a point of light, the soul. Then, planting himself before the canvas, he would proceed to classify this soul with his inexhaustible imagination, attributing to it almost every kind of stress and extremity. So great was the sway of his rapture that Julio, too, was able to see all that the artist flattered himself into believing that he had put into the owlish eyes. He also would paint souls, souls of women. In spite of the ease with which he developed his psychological creations, Argensola preferred to talk stretched on a divan, or to read hugging the fire while his friend and protector was outside. Another advantage this fondness for reading gave young Desnoyers was that he was no longer obliged to open a volume, scanning the index and last pages, just to get the idea. Formerly, when frequenting society functions, he had been guilty of coolly asking an author which was his best book, his smile of a clever man giving the writer to understand that he merely inquired so as not to waste time on the other volumes. Now it was no longer necessary to do this. Argensola would read for him. As soon as Julio would see him absorbed in a book, he would demand an immediate share. "Tell me the story." So the secretary not only gave him the plots of comedies and novels, but also detailed the argument of Schopenhauer or of Nietzsche. Dona Luisa almost wept on hearing her visitors, with that benevolence which wealth always inspires, speak of her son as a rather gay young man, but wonderfully well read. In exchange for his lessons, Argensola received much the same treatment as did the Greek slaves who taught rhetoric to the young patricians of decadent Rome. In the midst of a dissertation, his lord and friend would interrupt him with, "Get my dress suit ready. I am invited out this evening." At other times, when the instructor was luxuriating in bodily comfort, with a book in one hand, near the roaring stove, seeing through the windows the gray and rainy afternoon, his disciple would suddenly appear, saying, "Quick, get out! There's a woman coming." And Argensola, like a dog who gets up and shakes himself, would disappear to continue his reading in some miserable little coffee house in the neighborhood. In his official capacity, this widely gifted man often descended from the peaks of intellectuality to the vulgarities of everyday life. He was the steward of the lord of the manor, the intermediary between the pocketbook and those who appeared bill in hand. "Money," he would say laconically at the end of the month, and Desnoyers would break out into complaints and curses. Where on earth was he to get it? He would like to know. His father was as regular as a machine and would never allow the slightest advance upon the following month. He had to submit to a rule of misery. 3,000 francs a month! What could any decent person do with that? He was even trying to cut that down, to tighten the band, interfering in the running of his house, so that Dona Luisa could not make presents to her son. In vain he had appealed to the various usurers of Paris, telling them of his property beyond the ocean. These gentlemen had the youth of their own country in the hollow of their hand, and were not obliged to risk their capital in other lands. The same hard luck pursued him when, with sudden demonstrations of affection, he had tried to convince Don Marcelo that 3,000 francs a month was but a niggardly trifle. The millionaire fairly snorted with indignation. 3,000 francs a trifle! And the debts besides that he often had to pay for his son. "Why, when I was your age," he would begin saying, but Julio would suddenly bring the dialogue to a close. He had heard his father's story too many times. Ah, the stingy old miser! What he had been giving him all these months was no more than the interest on his grandfather's legacy. And by the advice of Argensola, he ventured to get control of the field. He was planning to hand over the management of his land to Celedonio, the old overseer who was now such a grandee in his country that Julio ironically called him "my uncle." Desnoyers accepted this rebellion coldly. "It appears just to me you are now of age." Then he promptly reduced to extremes his oversight of his home, forbidding Dona Luisa to handle any money. Henceforth he regarded his son as an adversary, treating him during his lightning apparitions at the avenue Victor Hugo with glacial courtesy, as though he were a stranger. For a while a transitory opulence enlivened the studio. Julio had increased his expenses, considering himself rich, but the letters from his uncle in America soon dissipated these illusions. At first the remittances exceeded very slightly the monthly allowance that his father had made him. Then it began to diminish in an alarming manner. According to Celedonio, all the calamities on earth seemed to be falling upon his plantation. The pasture land was yielding scantily, sometimes for lack of rain, sometimes because of floods, and the herds were perishing by hundreds. Julio required more income, and the crafty half-breed sent him what he asked for, but simply as a loan, reserving the return until they should adjust their accounts. In spite of such aid, young Desnoyers was suffering great want. He was gambling now in an elegant circle, thinking thus to compensate for his periodical scrimpings. But this resort was only making the remittances from America disappear with greater rapidity. That such a man as he was should be tormented for the lack of a few thousand francs! What else was a millionaire father for? If the creditors began threatening, the poor youth had to bring the secretary into play, ordering him to see the mother immediately. He himself wished to avoid her tears and reproaches, so Argensola would slip like a pickpocket up the service stairway of the great house on the avenue Victor Hugo. The place in which he transacted his ambassadorial business was the kitchen, with great danger that the terrible Desnoyers might happen in there on one of his perambulations as a laboring man and surprise the intruder. Dona Luisa would weep, touched by the heartrending tales of the messenger. What could she do? She was as poor as her maids. She had jewels, many jewels, but not a franc. Then Argensola came to the rescue with a solution worthy of his experience. he would smooth the way for the good mother, leaving some of her jewels at the Mont de Piete. He knew the way to raise money on them, so the lady accepted his advice, giving him, however, only jewels of medium value, as she suspected that she might never see them again. Later scruples made her at times refuse flatly. Suppose Don Marcelo should ever find it out! What a scene! But the Spaniard deemed it unseemly to return empty handed, and always bore away a basket of bottles from the well stocked wine cellar of the Desnoyers. Every morning Dona Luisa went to Saint Honore d'Eylau to pray for her son. She felt that this was her own church. It was a hospitable and familiar island in the unexplored ocean of Paris. Here she could exchange discreet salutations with her neighbors from the different republics of the New World. She felt nearer to God and the saints when she could hear in the vestibule conversations in her language. It was, moreover, a sort of salon in which took place the great events of the South American colony. One day was a wedding with flowers, orchestra, and chanting chorales. With Chichi beside her, she greeted those she knew, congratulating the bride and groom. Another day it was the funeral of an ex-president of some republic, or some other foreign dignitary, ending in Paris his turbulent existence. Poor president, poor general! Dona Luisa remembered the dead man. She had seen him many times in that church, devoutly attending mass, and she was indignant at the evil tongues which, under the cover of a funeral oration, recalled the shootings and bank failures in his country. Such a good and religious gentleman! May God receive his soul in glory! And upon going out into the square, she would look with tender eyes upon the young men and women on horseback going to the Bois de Boulogne, the luxurious automobiles, the morning radiant in the sunshine, all the primeval freshness of the early hours, realizing what a beautiful thing it is to live. Her devout expression of gratitude for mere existence usually included the monument in the center of the square, all bristling with wings as if about to fly away from the ground. Victor Hugo! It was enough for her to have heard this name on the lips of her son to make her contemplate the statue with a family interest. The only thing that she knew about the poet was that he had died. Of this she was almost sure, and she imagined that in life he was a great friend of Julio's, because she had so often heard her son repeat his name. Ay, her son! All her thoughts, her conjectures, her desires converged on him and her strong-willed husband. She longed for the men to come to an understanding and put an end to a struggle in which she was the principal victim. Would not God work this miracle? Like an invalid who goes from one sanitarium to another in pursuit of health, she gave up the church on her street to attend the Spanish chapel on the avenue Friedland. Here she considered herself even more among her own. End of section 16. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Part 1, Chapter 3, continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the midst of the fine and elegant South American ladies who looked as if they had just escaped from a fashion sheet, her eyes sought other women, not so well dressed, fat, with theatrical ermine and antique jewelry. When these high-born dames met each other in the vestibule, they spoke with heavy voices and expressive gestures, emphasizing their words energetically. The daughter of the ranch ventured to salute them because she had subscribed to all their pet charities, and upon seeing her greeting returned, she felt a satisfaction which made her momentarily forget her woes. They belonged to those families which her father had so greatly admired, without knowing why. They came from the mother country, and to the good Chicha were all excellentisimas or altisimas related to kings. She did not know whether to give them her hand or bend the knee, as she had vaguely heard was the custom at court. But soon she recalled her preoccupation and went forward to wrestle in prayer with God. Ay, that he would mercifully remember her, that he would not long forget her son. It was Glory that remembered Julio, stretching out to him her arms of light, so that he suddenly awoke to find himself surrounded by all the honors and advantages of celebrity. Fame cunningly surprises mankind on the most crooked and unexpected of roads. Neither the painting of souls nor a fitful existence full of extravagant love affairs and complicated duels had brought Desnoyers this renown. It was Glory that put him on his feet. A new pleasure for the delight of humanity had come from the other side of the seas. People were asking one another in the mysterious tones of the initiated who wish to recognize a familiar spirit, "Do you know how to tango?" The tango had taken possession of the world. It was the heroic hymn of a humanity that was suddenly concentrating its aspirations on the harmonious rhythm of the thigh joints, measuring its intelligence by the agility of its feet. An incoherent and monotonous music of African inspiration was satisfying the artistic ideals of a society that required nothing better. The world was dancing, dancing, dancing. A negro dance from Cuba, introduced into South America by mariners who shipped jerked beef to the Antilles, conquered the entire earth in a few months, completely encircling it, bounding victoriously from nation to nation. Like the Marseillaise, it was even penetrating into the most ceremonious courts, overturning all traditions of conservation and etiquette like a song of the revolution of frivolity. The Pope even had become a master of the dance, recommending the furlana instead of the tango, since all the Christian world, regardless of sects, was united in the common desire to agitate its feet with the tireless frenzy of the possessed of the Middle Ages. Julio Desnoyers, upon meeting this dance of his childhood in full swing in Paris, devoted himself to it with the confidence that an old love inspires. Who could have foretold that when as a student he was frequenting the lowest dance halls in Buenos Aires, watched by the police, that he was really serving an apprenticeship to glory? From 5 to 7 in the salons of the Champs-Elysees, where it cost 5 francs for a cup of tea and the privilege of joining in the sacred dance, hundreds of eyes followed him with admiration. "He has the key," said the women, appraising his slender elegance, medium stature, and muscular springs. And he, in abbreviated jacket and expansive shirt bosom, with his small girlish feet encased in high-heeled patent leathers with white tops, danced gravely, thoughtfully, silently, like a mathematician working out a problem, under the lights that shed bluish tones upon his plastered glossy locks. Ladies asked to be presented to him in the sweet hope that their friends might envy them when they beheld them in the arms of the master. Invitations simply rained upon Julio. The most exclusive salons were thrown open to him, so that every afternoon he made a dozen new acquaintances. The fashion had brought over professors from the other side of the sea, compatriots from the slums of Buenos Aires, haughty and confused at being applauded like famous lecturers or tenors. But Julio triumphed over these vulgarians who danced for money, and the incidents of his former life were considered by the women as deeds of romantic gallantry. "You are killing yourself," Argensola would say. "You are dancing too much." The glory of his friend and master was only making more trouble for him. His placid readings before the fire were now subject to daily interruptions. It was impossible to read more than a chapter. The celebrated man was continually ordering him to betake himself to the street. "A new lesson," sighed the parasite. And when he was alone in the studio, numerous callers, all women, some inquisitive and aggressive, others sad with a deserted air, were constantly interrupting his thoughtful pursuits. One of them terrified the occupants of the studio with her insistence. She was a North American of uncertain age, somewhere between 32 and 59, with short skirts that whenever she sat down seemed to fly up as if moved by a spring. Various dances with Desnoyers and a visit to the Rue de la Pompe she seemed to consider as her sacred rights, and she pursued the master with the desperation of an abandoned zealot. Julio had made good his escape upon learning that this beauty of youthful elegance, when seen from the back, had 2 grandchildren. "Master Desnoyers has gone out," Argensola would invariably say upon receiving her, and thereupon she would burst into tears and threats, longing to kill herself then and there, that her corpse might frighten away those other women who would come to rob her of what she considered her special privilege. Now it was Argensola who sped his companion to the street when he wished to be alone. He had only to remark casually, "I believe that Yankee is coming," and the great man would beat a hasty retreat, oftentimes in his desperate flight availing himself of the back stairs. At this time began to develop the most important event in Julio's existence. The Desnoyers family was to be united with that of Senator Lacour. Rene, his only son, had succeeded in awakening in Chichi a certain interest that was almost love. The dignitary enjoyed thinking of his son allied to the boundless plains and immense herds whose description always affected him like a marvelous tale. He was a widower, but he enjoyed giving at his home famous banquets and parties. Every new celebrity immediately suggested to him the idea of giving a dinner. No illustrious person passing through Paris, polar explorer or famous singer, could escape being exhibited in the dining room of Lacour. The son of Desnoyers, at whom he had scarcely glanced before, now inspired him with sudden interest. The senator was a thoroughly up-to-date man who did not classify glory nor distinguish reputations. It was enough for him that a name should be on everybody's lips, for him to accept it with enthusiasm. When Julio responded to his invitation, he presented him with pride to his friends and came very near to calling him dear master. The tango was monopolizing all conversation nowadays. Even in the academy they were taking it up in order to demonstrate that the youth of ancient Athens had diverted itself in a somewhat similar way, and Lacour had dreamed all his life of an Athenian republic. At these reunions, Desnoyers became acquainted with the Lauriers. He was an engineer who owned a motor factory for automobiles in the outskirts of Paris, a man about 35, tall, rather heavy and silent, with a deliberate air as though he wished to see deeply into men and things. She was of a light, frivolous character, loving life for the satisfactions and pleasures which it brought her, appearing to accept with smiling conformity the silent and grave adoration of her husband. She could not well do less with a man of his merits. Besides, she had brought to the marriage a dowry of 300,000 francs, a capital which had enabled the engineer to enlarge his business. The senator had been instrumental in arranging this marriage. He was interested in Laurier because he was the son of an old friend. Upon Marguerite Laurier, the presence of Julio flashed like a ray of sunlight in the tiresome salon of Lacour. She was dancing the fad of the hour and frequenting the tango teas where reigned the adored Desnoyers. And to think that she was being entertained with this celebrated and interesting man that the other women were raving about, in order that he might not take her for a mere middle-class woman like the other guests at the senator's party. She spoke of her modistes, all up from the Rue de la Paix, declaring gravely that no woman who had any self-respect could possibly walk through the streets wearing a gown costing less than 800 francs, and that the hat of 1,000 francs but a few years ago an astonishing novelty was nowadays a very ordinary affair. This acquaintanceship made the little Laurier, as her friends called her, notwithstanding her tallness, much sought by the master of the dance, in spite of the looks of wrath and envy hurled at her by the others. What a triumph for the wife of a simple engineer who was used to going everywhere in her mother's automobile! Julio at first had supposed her like all the others who were languishing in his arms, following the rhythmic complications of the dance, but he soon found that she was very different. Her coquetry after the first confidential words but increased his admiration. He really had never before been thrown with a woman of her class. Those of his first social period were the habitues of the night restaurants, paid for their witchery. Now Glory was tossing into his arms ladies of high position, but with an unconfessable past, anxious for novelties, although exceedingly mature. This middle class woman, who would advance so confidently toward him and then retreat with such capricious outbursts of modesty, was a new type for him. The tango salons soon began to suffer a great loss. Desnoyers was permitting himself to be seen there with less frequency, handing Glory over to the professionals. Sometimes entire weeks slipped by without the 5 to 7 devotees being able to admire his black locks and his tiny patent leathers twinkling under the lights in time with his graceful movements. Marguerite was also avoiding these places. The meetings of the two were taking place in accordance with what she had read in the love stories of Paris. She was going in search of Julio, fearing to be recognized, tremulous with emotion, selecting her most inconspicuous suit and covering her face with a close veil, the veil of adultery, as her friends called it. They had their trysts in the least frequented squares of the district, frequently changing the places, like timid birds that at the slightest disturbance fly to the perch a little further away. Sometimes they would meet in the Butte Chaumont. At others, they preferred the gardens on the left bank of the Seine, the Luxembourg, and even the distant Parc de Montsouris. She was always in tremors of terror lest her husband might surprise them, although she well knew that the industrious engineer was in his factory a great distance away. Her agitated aspect, her excessive precautions in order to slip by unseen, only served to attract the attention of the passers-by. Although Julio was waxing impatient with the annoyance of this wandering love affair, which only amounted to a few fugitive kisses, he finally held his peace, dominated by Marguerite's pleadings. She did not wish merely to be one of the procession of his sweethearts. It was necessary to convince herself first that this love was going to last forever. It was her first slip, and she wanted it to be the last. Ay, her former spotless reputation! What would people say? The two returned to their adolescent period, loving each other as they had never loved before, with the confident and childish passion of 15-year-olds. Julio had leaped from childhood to libertinism, taking his initiation into life at a single bound. She had desired marriage in order to acquire the respect and liberty of a married woman, but feeling toward her husband only a vague gratitude. "We end where others begin," she said to Desnoyers. Their passion took the form of an intense, reciprocal, and vulgar love. They felt a romantic sentimentality in clasping hands or exchanging kisses on a garden bench in the twilight. He was treasuring a ringlet of Marguerite's, although he doubted its genuineness, with a vague suspicion that it might be one of the latest wisps of fashion. She would cuddle down with her head on his shoulder, as though imploring his protection, although always in the open air. If Julio ever attempted greater intimacy in a carriage, Madame would repel him most vigorously. A contradictory duality appeared to inspire her actions. Every morning, on awaking, she would decide to yield; but then, when near him, her middle class respectability, jealous of its reputation, kept her faithful to her mother's teachings. One day she agreed to visit his studio with the interest that the haunts of the loved one always inspires. "Promise that you will not take advantage of me." He readily promised, swearing that everything should be as Marguerite wished. But from that day they were no longer seen in the gardens, nor wandering around persecuted by the winter winds. They preferred the studio, and Argensola had to rearrange his existence, seeking the stove of another artist friend in order to continue his reading. End of Section 17. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Chapter 3 continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This state of things lasted 2 months. They never knew what secret force suddenly disturbed their tranquility. Perhaps one of her friends, guessing at the truth, had told the husband anonymously. Perhaps it was she herself unconsciously, with her inexpressible happiness, her tardy returns home when dinner was already served, and the sudden aversion which she showed toward the engineer in their hours alone, trying to keep her heart faithful to her lover. To divide her interests between her legal companion and the man she loved was a torment that her simple and vehement enthusiasm could not tolerate. While she was hurrying one night through the Rue de la Pompe, looking at her watch and trembling with impatience at not finding an automobile or even a cab, a man stood in front of her. Etienne Laurier. She always shuddered with fear on recalling that hour. For a moment she believed that he was going to kill her. Serious men, quiet and diffident, are most terrible in their explosions of wrath. Her husband knew everything. With the same patience that he employed in solving his industrial problems, he had been studying her day by day, without her ever suspecting the watchfulness behind that impassive countenance. Then he had followed her in order to complete the evidence of his misfortune. Marguerite had never supposed that he could be so common and noisy in his anger. She had expected that he would accept the facts coldly, with that slight tinge of philosophical irony usually shown by distinguished men, as the husbands of her friends had done. But the poor engineer, who outside of his work saw only his wife, loving her as a woman and adoring her as a dainty and superior being, a model of grace and elegance, could not endure the thought of her downfall, and cried and threatened without reserve, so that the scandal became known throughout their entire circle of friends. The senator felt greatly annoyed in remembering that it was in his exclusive home that the guilty ones had become acquainted. But his displeasure was visited upon the husband. What lack of good taste! Women will be women, and everything is capable of adjustment. But before the imprudent outbursts of this frantic devil, no elegant solution was possible, and there was now nothing to do but to begin divorce proceedings. Desnoyers Senior was very indignant upon learning of this last escapade of his son. He had always had a great liking for Laurier. That instinctive bond which exists between men of industry, patient and silent, had made them very congenial. At the senator's receptions he had always talked with the engineer about the progress of his business, interesting himself in the development of that factory of which he always spoke with the affection of a father. The millionaire, in spite of his reputation for miserliness, had even volunteered his disinterested support if at any time it should become necessary to enlarge the plant. And it was this good man's happiness that his son, a frivolous and useless dancer was going to steal. At first Laurier spoke of a duel. His wrath was that of a work horse who breaks the tight reins of his laboring outfit, tosses his mane, neighs wildly, and bites. The father was greatly distressed at the possibility of such an outcome. One scandal more. Julio had dedicated the greater part of his existence to the handling of arms. "He will kill the poor man," he said to the senator. "I am sure that he will kill him. It is the logic of life. The good for nothing always kill those who amount to anything." But there was no killing. The father of the Republic knew how to handle the clashing parties with the same skill that he always employed in the corridors of the Senate during a ministerial crisis. The scandal was hushed up. Marguerite went to live with her mother and took the first steps for a divorce. Some evenings, when the studio clock was striking 7, she would yawn and say sadly, "I must go. I have to go, although this is my true home. Ah, what a pity that we are not married!" And he, feeling a whole garden of bourgeois virtues hitherto ignored, burst into bloom, repeated in a tone of conviction, "That's so. Why are we not married?" Their wishes could be realized. The husband was facilitating the step by his unexpected intervention. So young Desnoyers set forth for South America in order to raise the money and marry Marguerite. End of Section 18. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Part 1, Chapter 4 of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, The Cousin from Berlin. The studio of Julio Desnoyers was on the top floor, both the stairway and the elevator stopping before his door. The two tiny apartments at the back were lighted by an interior court, their only means of communication being the service stairway which went on up to the garrets. While his comrade was away, Argensola had made the acquaintance of those in the neighboring lodgings. The largest of the apartments was empty during the day, its occupants not returning till after they had taken their evening meal in a restaurant. As both husband and wife were employed outside, they could not remain at home except on holidays. The man, vigorous and of a martial aspect, was superintendent in a big department store. He had been a soldier in Africa, wore a military decoration, and had the rank of sub-lieutenant in the reserves. She was a blonde, heavy and rather anemic, with bright eyes and a sentimental expression. On holidays she spent long hours at the piano, playing musical reveries, always the same. At other times Argensola saw her through the interior window, working in the kitchen, aided by her companion, the two laughing over their clumsiness and inexperience in preparing the Sunday dinner. The concierge thought that this woman was a German, but she herself said that she was a Swiss. She was a cashier in a shop, not the one in which her husband was employed. In the mornings they left home together, separating in the Place d'Etoile. At 7 in the evening they met here, greeting each other with a kiss, like lovers who meet for the first time, and then after supper they returned to their nest in the Rue de la Pompe. All Argensola's attempts at friendliness with these neighbors were repulsed because of their self-centeredness. They responded with freezing courtesy. They lived only for themselves. The other apartment of 2 rooms was occupied by a single man. He was a Russian or Pole who almost always returned with a package of books, and passed many hours writing near the patio window. From the very first, the Spaniard took him to be a mysterious man, probably a very distinguished one, a true hero of a novel. The foreign appearance of this Tchernoff made a great impression upon him. His disheveled beard and oily locks, his spectacles upon a large nose that seemed deformed by a dagger thrust. There emanated from him, like an invisible nimbus, an odor of cheap wine and soiled clothing. When Argensola caught a glimpse of him through the service door, he would say to himself, "Ah, friend Tchernoff is returning," and thereupon he would saunter out to the stairway in order to have a chat with his neighbor. For a long time the stranger discouraged all approach to his quarters, which fact led the Spaniard to infer that he devoted himself to alchemy and kindred mysteries. When he finally was allowed to enter, he saw only books, many books, books everywhere, scattered on the floor, heaped upon benches, piled in corners, overflowing onto broken down chairs, old tables, and a bed that was only made up now and then when the owner, alarmed by the increasing invasion of dust and cobwebs, was obliged to call in the aid of his friend, the concierge. Argensola finally realized, not without a certain disenchantment, that there was nothing mysterious in the life of the man. What he was writing near the window were merely translations, some of them ordered, others volunteer work for the socialist periodicals. The only marvelous thing about him was the quantity of languages that he knew. "He knows them all," said the Spaniard when describing their neighbor to Desnoyers. "He has only to hear of a new one to master it. He holds the key, the secret of all languages, living or dead. He speaks Castilian as well as we do, and yet he has never been in a Spanish speaking country." Argensola again felt a thrill of mystery upon reading the titles of many of the volumes. The majority were old books, many of them in languages that he was not able to decipher, picked up for a song at second-hand shops or in the bookstands installed upon the parapets of the Seine. Only a man holding the key of tongues could get together such volumes. An atmosphere of mysticism, of superhuman insight, of secrets intact for many centuries appeared to emanate from these heaps of dusty volumes with worm-eaten leaves. And mixed with these ancient tomes were others, red and conspicuous, pamphlets of socialistic propaganda, leaflets in all the languages of Europe, and periodicals, many periodicals with revolutionary titles. Tchernoff did not appear to enjoy visits and conversation. He would smile enigmatically into his black beard and was very sparing with his words so as to shorten the interview. But Argensola possessed the means of winning over this sullen personage. It was only necessary for him to wink one eye with the expressive invitation, "Do we go?" and the two would soon be settled on a bench in the kitchen of Desnoyers' studio, opposite a bottle which had come from the avenue Victor Hugo. The costly wines of Don Marcelo made the Russian more communicative, although in spite of this aid, the Spaniard learned little of his neighbor's real existence. Sometimes he would mention Jaurès and other socialistic orators. His surest means of existence was the translation of periodicals or party papers. On various occasions the name of Siberia escaped from his lips, and he admitted that he had been there a long time. But he did not care to talk about a country visited against his will. He would merely smile modestly, showing plainly that he did not wish to make any further revelations. The morning after the return of Julio Desnoyers, while Argensola was talking on the stairway with Tchernoff, the bell rang. How annoying! The Russian, who was well up in advanced politics, was just explaining the plans advanced by Jaurès. There were still many who hoped that war might be averted. He had his motives for doubting it. He, Tchernoff, was commenting on these illusions with the smile of a flat-nosed sphinx, when the bell rang for a second time, so that Argensola was obliged to break away from his interesting friend and run to open the main door. A gentleman wished to see Julio. He spoke very correct French, though his accent was a revelation for Argensola. Upon going into the bedroom in search of his master, who was just arising, he said confidently, "It's the cousin from Berlin who has come to say good bye. It could not be anyone else." When the three came together in the studio, Desnoyers presented his comrade in order that the visitor might not make any mistake in regard to his social status. "I have heard him spoken of. The gentleman is Argensola, a very deserving youth." Dr. Julius von Hartrott said this with the self-sufficiency of a man who knows everything and wishes to be agreeable to an inferior, conceding him the alms of his attention. The two cousins confronted each other with a curiosity not altogether free from distrust. Although closely related, they knew each other very slightly, tacitly admitting complete divergence in opinions and tastes. After slowly examining the sage, Argensola came to the conclusion that he looked like an officer dressed as a civilian. He noticed in his person an effort to imitate the soldierly when occasionally discarding uniform, the ambition of every German burgher wishing to be taken for the superior class. His trousers were narrow, as though intended to be tucked into cavalry boots. His coat, with the 2 rows of buttons, had the contracted waist, with very full skirt and upstanding lapels, suggesting vaguely a military greatcoat. The reddish moustachios, strong jaw, and shaved head completed his would-be martial appearance. But his eyes, large, dark-circled, and near-sighted, were the eyes of a student taking refuge behind great thick glasses, which gave him the aspect of a man of peace. Desnoyers knew that he was an assistant professor of the university, that he had published a few volumes, fat and heavy as bricks, and that he was a member of an academic society collaborating in documentary research directed by a famous historian. In his lapel he was wearing the badge of a foreign order. Julio's respect for the learned member of the family was not unmixed with contempt. He and his sister Chichi had from childhood felt an instinctive hostility toward the cousins from Berlin. It annoyed him, too, to have his family everlastingly holding up as a model this pedant who only knew life as it is in books, and passed his existence investigating what men had done in other epochs, in order to draw conclusions in harmony with Germany's views. While young Desnoyers had great facility for admiration, and reverenced all those whose arguments Argensola had doled out to him, he drew the line at accepting the intellectual grandeur of this illustrious relative. During his stay in Berlin, a German word for vulgar invention had enabled him to classify this prig. Heavy books of minute investigation were every month being published by the dozens in the fatherland. There was not a professor who could resist the temptation of constructing from the simplest detail an enormous volume written in a dull, involved style. The people, therefore, appreciating that these nearsighted authors were incapable of any genial vision of comradeship, called them Sitzfleisch haben, because of the very long sittings which their works represented. That was what this cousin was for him, a mere Sitzfleisch haben. Dr. von Hartrott, on explaining his visit, spoke in Spanish. He availed himself of this language used by the family during his childhood as a precaution, looking around repeatedly as if he feared to be heard. He had come to bid his cousin farewell. His mother had told him of his return, and he had not wished to leave Paris without seeing him. He was leaving in a few hours, since matters were growing more strained. "But do you really believe that there will be war?" asked Desnoyers. "War will be declared tomorrow or the day after. Nothing can prevent it now. It is necessary for the welfare of humanity." Silence followed this speech, Julio and Argensola looking with astonishment at this peaceable-looking man who had just spoken with such martial arrogance. The two suspected that the professor was making this visit in order to give vent to his opinions and enthusiasms. At the same time, perhaps, he was trying to find out what they might think and know, as one of the many viewpoints of the people in Paris. "You are not French," he added, looking at his cousin. "You were born in Argentina, so before you I may speak the truth." "And were you not born there?" asked Julio, smiling. The doctor made a gesture of protest, as though he had just heard something insulting. "No, I am a German. No matter where a German may be born, he always belongs to his mother country." Then, turning to Argensola, This gentleman, too, is a foreigner. He comes from noble Spain, which owes to us the best that it has, the worship of honor, the knightly spirit." The Spaniard wished to remonstrate, but the sage would not permit, adding in an oracular tone: "You were miserable Celts, sunk in the vileness of an inferior and mongrel race, whose domination by Rome but made your situation worse. Fortunately, you were conquered by the Goths and others of our race, who implanted in you a sense of personal dignity. Do not forget, young man, that the Vandals were the ancestors of the Prussians of today." Again Argensola tried to speak, but his friend signed to him not to interrupt the professor, who appeared to have forgotten his former reserve and was working up to an enthusiastic pitch with his own words. "We are going to witness great events," he continued. "Fortunate are those born in this epoch, the most interesting in history. At this very moment, humanity is changing its course. Now the true civilization begins." The war, according to him, was going to be of a brevity hitherto unseen. Germany had been preparing herself to bring about this event without any long economic world disturbance. A single month would be enough to crush France, the most to be feared of their adversaries. Then they would march against Russia, who, with her slow, clumsy movements, could not oppose an immediate defense. Finally, they would attack haughty England, so isolated in its archipelago that it could not obstruct the sweep of German progress. This would make a series of rapid blows and overwhelming victories, requiring only a summer in which to play this magnificent role. The fall of the leaves in the following autumn would greet the definite triumph of Germany. With the assurance of a professor who does not expect his dictum to be refuted by his hearers, he explained the superiority of the German race. All mankind was divided into two groups, dolicephalus and the brachycephalus, according to the shape of the skull. Another scientific classification divided men into the light-haired and dark-haired. The dolicephalus, arched heads, represented purity of race and superior mentality. The brachycephalus, flat heads, were mongrels with all the stigma of degeneration. The German, dolicephalus par excellence, was the only descendant of the primitive Aryans. All the other nations, especially those of the south of Europe, called Latins, belonged to a degenerate humanity. The Spaniard could not contain himself any longer. "But no person with any intelligence believes any more in those antique theories of race. What if there no longer existed a people of absolutely pure blood, owing to thousands of admixtures due to historical conquests?" Many Germans bore the identical ethnic marks which the professor was attributing to the inferior races. "There is something in that," admitted Hartrott. "But although the German race may not be perfectly pure, it is the least impure of all races, and therefore should have dominion over the world." His voice took on an ironic and cutting edge when speaking of the Celts, inhabitants of the lands of the south. They had retarded the progress of humanity, deflecting it in the wrong direction. The Celt is individualistic and consequently an ungovernable revolutionary who tends to socialism. Furthermore, he is a humanitarian and makes a virtue of mercy, defending the existence of the weak who do not amount to anything. The illustrious German places above everything else method and power. Elected by nature to command the impotent races, he possesses all the qualifications that distinguish the superior leader. The French Revolution was merely a clash between Teutons and Celts. The nobility of France were descended from Germanic warriors, established in the country after the so-called invasion of the barbarians. The middle and lower classes were the Gallic Celtic element. The inferior race had conquered the superior, disorganizing the country and perturbing the world. Celtism was the inventor of democracy, of the doctrines of socialism and anarchy. Now the hour of Germanic retaliation was about to strike, and the northern race would re-establish order, since God had favored it by demonstrating its indisputable superiority. "A nation," he added, "can aspire to great destinies only when it is fundamentally Teutonic. The less German it is, the less its civilization amounts to. We represent the aristocracy of humanity, the salt of the earth, as our William said." End of section 19. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Part 1, Chapter 4 continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Argensola was listening with astonishment to this outpouring of conceit. All the great nations had passed through the fever of imperialism. The Greeks aspired to world rule because they were the most civilized and believed themselves the most fit to give civilization to the rest of mankind. The Romans, upon conquering countries, implanted law and rule of justice. The French of the Revolution and the Empire justified their invasions on the plea that they wished to liberate mankind and spread abroad new ideas. Even the Spaniards of the 16th century, when battling half of Europe for religious unity and the extermination of heresy, were working toward their ideals, obscure and perhaps erroneous, but disinterested. All the nations of history had been struggling for something which they had considered generous and above their own interests. Germany alone, according to this professor, was trying to impose itself upon the world in the name of racial superiority, a superiority that nobody had recognized, that she was arrogating to herself, coating her affirmations with a varnish of false science. Until now, wars have been carried on by the soldiery, continued Hartrott. That which is now going to begin will be waged by a combination of soldiers and professors. In its preparation, the university has taken as much part as the military staff. German science, leader of all sciences, is united forever with what the Latin revolutionists disdainfully term militarism. Force, mistress of the world, is what creates right, that which our truly unique civilization imposes. Our armies are the representatives of our culture, and in a few weeks we shall free the world from its decadence, completely rejuvenating it. The vision of the immense future of his race was leading him on to expose himself with lyrical enthusiasm. William I, Bismarck, all the heroes of past victories inspired his veneration, but he spoke of them as dying gods whose hour had passed. They were glorious ancestors of modest pretensions who had confined their activities to enlarging the frontiers and to establishing the unity of the empire, afterwards opposing themselves with the prudence of valetudinarians to the daring of the new generation. Their ambitions went no further than a continental hegemony. But now William II had leaped into the arena, the complex hero that the country required. Lamprecht, my master, has pictured his greatness. It is tradition, and the future, method and audacity. Like his grandfather, the emperor holds the conviction of what monarchy, by the grace of God, represents. But his vivid and modern intelligence recognizes and accepts modern conditions. At the same time that he is romantic, feudal, and a supporter of the agrarian conservatives, he is also an up-to-date man who seeks practical solutions and shows a utilitarian spirit. In him are correctly balanced instinct and reason. Germany, guided by this hero, had, according to Hartrott, been concentrating its strength and recognizing its true path. The university supported him even more unanimously than the army. Why store up so much power and maintain it without employment? The empire of the world belongs to the German people. The historians and philosophers, disciples of Treitschke, were taking it upon themselves to frame the rights that would justify this universal domination. And Lamprecht, the psychological historian, like the other professors, was launching the belief in the absolute superiority of the Germanic race. It was just that it should rule the world, since it only had the power to do so. This Tellurian Germanization was to be of immense benefit to mankind. The earth was going to be happy under the dictatorship of a people born for mastery. The German state, tentacular potency, would eclipse with its glory the most imposing empire of the past and present. Gott mit uns. Who will be able to deny, as my master says, that there exists a Christian German God, the great ally, who is showing himself to our enemies, the foreigners, as a strong and jealous divinity?" Desnoyers was listening to his cousin with astonishment, and at the same time looking at Argensola, who with a flutter of his eyes seemed to be saying to him, "He is mad! These Germans are simply mad with pride." Meanwhile, the professor, unable to curb his enthusiasm, continued expounding the grandeur of his race. From his viewpoint, the providential Kaiser had shown inexplicable weakenings. He was too good and too kind, deliciae generis humani, as had said Professor Lasson, another of Hartrott's masters. Able to overthrow everything with his annihilating power, the emperor was limiting himself merely to maintaining peace. But the nation did not wish to stop there, and was pushing its leader until it had him started. It was useless now to put on the brakes. "He who does not advance recedes." That was the cry of Pan Germanism to the emperor. He must press on in order to conquer the entire world. "And now war comes," continued the pedant. "We need the colonies of the others, even though Bismarck, through an error of his stubborn old age, exacted nothing at the time of universal distribution, letting England and France get possession of the best lands. We must control all countries that have Germanic blood, and have been civilized by our forebears." Hartrott enumerated these countries. Holland and Belgium were German. France, through the Franks, was 1/3 Teutonic blood. Italy. Here the professor hesitated, recalling the fact that this nation was still an ally, certainly a little insecure, but still united by diplomatic bonds. He mentioned, nevertheless, the Longobards and other races coming from the north. Spain and Portugal had been populated by the ruddy Goth, and also belonged to the dominant race. And since the majority of the nations of America were of Spanish and Portuguese origin, they should also be included in this recovery. "It is a little premature to think of these last nations just yet," added the doctor modestly, "but some day the hour of justice will sound. After our continental triumph, we shall have time to think of their fate. North America also should receive our civilizing influence, for there are living millions of Germans who have created its greatness." He was talking of the future conquests as though they were marks of distinction with which his country was going to favor other countries. These were to continue living politically the same as before, with their individual governments, but subject to the Teutons, like miners requiring the strong hand of a master. They would form the universal United States, with the hereditary and all-powerful president, the Emperor of Germany, receiving all the benefits of Germanic culture, working disciplined under his industrial direction. But the world is ungrateful, and human badness always opposes itself to progress. "We have no illusions," sighed the professor with lofty sadness. "We have no friends. All look upon us with jealousy, as dangerous beings, because we are the most intelligent, the most active, and have proved ourselves superior to all others. But since they no longer love us, let them fear us. As my friend Mann says, although Kultur is the spiritual organization of the world, it does not exclude bloody savagery when that becomes necessary. Kultur sanctifies the demon within us, and is above morality, reason, and science. We are going to impose Kultur by force of the cannon." Argensola continued saying with his eyes, "They are crazy, crazy with pride. What can the world expect of such people?" Desnoyers here intervened in order to brighten this gloomy monologue with a little optimism. War had not yet been positively declared. The diplomats were still trying to arrange matters. perhaps it might all turn out peaceably in the last minute, as had so often happened before. His cousin was seeing things entirely distorted by an aggressive enthusiasm. Oh, the ironical, ferocious, and cutting smile of the doctor! Argensola had never known old Madariaga, but it nevertheless occurred to him that in this fashion sharks must smile, although he, too, had never seen a shark. "It is war," boomed Hartrott. "When I left Germany 15 days ago, I knew that war was inevitable." The certainty with which he said this dissipated all Julio's hope. Moreover, this man's trip, on the pretext of seeing his mother, disquieted him. On what mission had Dr. Julius von Hartrott come to Paris? "Well, then," asked Desnoyers, "why so many diplomatic interviews? Why does the German government intervene at all, although in such a lukewarm way, in the struggle between Austria and Servia? Would it not be better to declare war right out?" The professor replied with simplicity: "Our government undoubtedly wishes that the others should declare the war. The role of outraged dignity is always the most pleasing one and justifies all ulterior resolutions, however extreme they may seem. There are some of our people who are living comfortably and do not desire war. It is expedient to make them believe that those who impose it upon us are our enemies, so that they may feel the necessity of defending themselves. Only superior minds reach the conviction of the great advancement that can be accomplished by the sword alone, and that war, as our Grand Treitschke says, is the highest form of progress." Again he smiled with a ferocious expression. Morality, from his point of view, should exist among individuals only to make them more obedient and disciplined. For morality per se impedes governments, and should be suppressed as a useless obstacle. For the state there exists neither truth nor falsehood. It only recognizes the utility of things. The glorious Bismarck, in order to consummate the war with France, the base of German grandeur, had not hesitated to falsify a telegraphic dispatch. And remember that he is the most glorious hero of our time. History looks leniently upon his heroic feat. Who would accuse the one who triumphs? Professor Hans Delbruck has written with reason, "Blessed be the hand that falsified the telegram of Ems." It was convenient to have the war break out immediately, in order that events might result favorably for Germany, whose enemies are totally unprepared. Preventive war was recommended by General Bernhardi and other illustrious patriots. It would be dangerous indeed to defer the declaration of war until the enemies had fortified themselves so that they should be the ones to make war. Besides, to the Germans, what kind of deterrence could law and other fictions invented by weak nations possibly be? No, they had the power, and power creates new laws. If they proved to be the victors, history would not investigate too closely the means by which they had conquered. It was Germany that was going to win, and the priests of all cults would finally sanctify with their chants the blessed war, if it led to triumph. We are not making war in order to punish the Servian regicides, nor to free the Poles, nor the others oppressed by Russia, stopping there in admiration of our disinterested magnanimity. We wish to wage it because we are the first people of earth, and should extend our activity over the entire planet. Germany's hour has sounded. We are going to take our place as the powerful mistress of the world. The place which Spain occupied in former centuries, afterwards France, and England today. What those people accomplished in a struggle of many years, we are going to bring about in 4 months. The storm flag of the empire is now going to wave over nations and oceans. The sun is going to shine on a great slaughter. Old Rome, sick unto death, called barbarians the Germans who opened the grave. The world today also smells death and will surely call us barbarians. So be it. When Tangiers and Toulouse, Ambert and Calais have become submissive to German barbarism, then we will speak further of this matter. We have the power, and who has that needs neither to hesitate nor to argue. Power. That is the beautiful word, the only word that rings true and clear. Power, one sure stab, and all argument is answered forever. "But are you so sure of victory?" asked Desnoyers. "Sometimes destiny gives us great surprises. There are hidden forces that we must take into consideration, or they may overturn the best laid plans." The smile of the doctor became increasingly scornful and arrogant. Everything had been foreseen and studied out long ago with the most minute Germanic method. What had they to fear? The enemy most to be reckoned with was France, incapable of resisting the enervating moral influences, the sufferings, the strain and privations of war. A nation physically debilitated and so poisoned by revolutionary spirit that it had laid aside the use of arms through an exaggerated love of comfort. "Our generals," he announced, "are going to leave her in such a state that she will never again cross our path." There was Russia, too, to consider, but her amorphous masses were slow to assemble and unwieldy to move. The executive staff of Berlin had timed everything by measure for crushing France in 4 weeks, and would then lead its enormous forces against the Russian Empire before it could begin action. "We shall finish with the bear after killing the cock," affirmed the professor triumphantly. But guessing some objection from his cousin, he hastened on. "I know what you are going to tell me. There remains another enemy, one that has not yet leaped into the lists, but which all the Germans are waiting for. That one inspires more hatred than all the others put together, because it is of our blood, because it is a traitor to the race. Ah, how we loathe it!" And in the tone in which these words were uttered throbbed an expression of hatred and a thirst for vengeance which astonished both listeners. "Even though England attack us," continued Hartrott, "we shall conquer, notwithstanding. This adversary is not more terrible than the others. For the past century she has ruled the world. Upon the fall of Napoleon she seized the continental hegemony and will fight to keep it. But what does her energy amount to? As our Bernhardi says, the English people are merely a nation of renters and sportsmen. Their army is formed from the dregs of the nation. The country lacks military spirit. We are a people of warriors, and it will be an easy thing for us to conquer the English, debilitated by a false conception of life." The doctor paused, then added, "We are counting on the internal corruption of our enemies, on their lack of unity. God will aid us by sowing confusion among these detested people. In a few days you will see His hand. Revolution is going to break out in France at the same time as war. The people of Paris will build barricades in the streets, and the scenes of the Commune will repeat themselves. Tunis, Algiers, and all their other possessions are about to rise against the metropolis." Argensola seized the opportunity to smile with an aggressive incredulity. "I repeat it," insisted Hartrott, "that this country is going to have internal revolution and colonial insurrection. I know perfectly well what I am talking about. Russia will also break out into revolution with a red flag that will force the Czar to beg for mercy on his knees. You have only to read the papers of the recent strikes in St. Petersburg and the manifestations of the strikers with the pretext of President Poincaré's visit. England will see her appeals to her colonies completely ignored. India is going to rise against her, and Egypt, too, will seize this opportunity for her emancipation." Julio was beginning to be impressed by these affirmations enunciated with such oracular certainty, and he felt almost irritated at the incredulous Argensola, who continued looking insolently at the seer, repeating with his winking eyes, "He is insane, insane with pride." The man certainly must have strong reasons for making such awful prophecies. His presence in Paris just at this time was difficult for Desnoyers to understand, and gave to his words a mysterious authority. "But the nations will defend themselves," he protested to his cousin. "Victory will not be such a very simple thing as you imagine." "Yes, They will defend themselves, and the struggle will be fiercely contested. It appears that of late years France has been paying some attention to her army. We shall undoubtedly encounter some resistance. Triumph may be somewhat difficult, but we are going to prevail. You have no idea to what extent the offensive power of Germany has attained. Nobody knows with certainty beyond the frontiers. If our foes should comprehend it in all its immensity, they would fall on their knees beforehand to beg for mercy, thus obviating the necessity for useless sacrifices. End of section 20. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Part 1, Chapter 4, continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was a long silence. Julius von Hartrott appeared lost in reverie. The very thought of the accumulated strength of his race submerged him in a species of mystic adoration. "The preliminary victory," he suddenly exclaimed, "we gained some time ago. Our enemies, therefore, hate us, and yet they imitate us. All that bears the stamp of Germany is in demand throughout the world. The very countries that are trying to resist our arms copy our methods in their universities and admire our theories. Even those which do not attain success in Germany. Oftentimes we laugh among ourselves, like the Roman augurs, upon seeing the servility with which they follow us. And yet they will not admit our superiority." For the first time, Argensola's eyes and general expression approved the words of Hartrott. What he had just said was only too true. The world was a victim of the German superstition, an intellectual cowardice. The fear of force had made it admire en masse and indiscriminately everything of Teutonic origin, just because of the intensity of its glitter. Gold mixed with talcum. The so-called Latins, dazed with admiration, were with unreasonable pessimism becoming doubtful of their ability, and thus were the first to decree their own death. And the conceited Germans merely had to repeat the words of these pessimists in order to strengthen their belief in their own superiority. With that southern temperament which leaps rapidly from one extreme to another, many Latins had proclaimed that in the world of the future there would be no place for the Latin peoples, now in their death agony, adding that Germany alone preserved the latent forces of civilization. The French, who declaimed among themselves with the greatest exaggeration, unconscious that folks were listening the other side of the door, had proclaimed repeatedly for many years past that France was degenerating rapidly and would soon vanish from the earth. Then why should they resent the scorn of their enemies? Why shouldn't the Germans share their beliefs? The professor, misinterpreting the silent agreement of the Spaniard, who until then had been listening with such a hostile smile, added, "Now is the time to try out in France the German culture, implanting it there as conquerors." Here Argensola interrupted. "And what if there is no such thing as German culture, as a celebrated Teuton says?" It had become necessary to contradict this pedant who had become insufferable with his egotism. Hartrott almost jumped from his chair on hearing such a doubt. "What German is that?" "Nietzsche." The professor looked at him pityingly. Nietzsche had said to mankind, "Be harsh," affirming that a righteous war sanctifies every cause. He had exalted Bismarck. He had taken part in the War of '70. He was glorifying Germany when he spoke of the smiling lion and the blonde beast. But Argensola listened with the tranquility of one sure of his ground. Oh, hours of placid reading near the studio chimney, listening to the rain beating against the pane. The philosopher did say that, he admitted, and he said many other very different things, like all great thinkers. His doctrine is one of pride, but of individual pride, not that of a nation or race. He always spoke against the insidious fallacy of race. Argensola recalled his philosophy word for word. Culture, according to Nietzsche, was unity of style in all the manifestations of life. Science did not necessarily include culture. Great knowledge might be accompanied by great barbarity, by the absence of style, or by the chaotic confusion of all styles. Germany, according to the philosopher, had no genuine culture owing to its lack of style. The French, he had said, were at the head of an authentic and fruitful culture, whatever their valor might be, and until now everybody had drawn upon it. Their hatreds were concentrated within their own country. I cannot endure Germany. The spirit of servility and pettiness penetrates everywhere. I believe only in French culture, and what the rest of Europe calls culture appears to me to be a mistake. The few individual cases of lofty culture that I met in Germany were of French origin. You know," continued Argensola, "that in quarreling with Wagner about the excess of Germanism in his art, Nietzsche proclaimed the necessity of Mediterraneanizing music. His ideal was a culture for all Europe, but with a Latin base." Julius von Hartrott replied most disdainfully to this, repeating the Spaniard's very words. Men who thought much said many things. Besides, Nietzsche was a poet, completely demented at his death, and was no authority among the university sages. His fame had only been recognized in foreign lands, and he paid no further attention to the youth, ignoring him as though he had evaporated into thin air after his presumption. All the professor's attention was now concentrated on Desnoyers. "This country," he resumed, "is dying from within. How can you doubt that revolution will break out the minute war is declared? Have you not noticed the agitation of the boulevard on account of the Caillaux trial? Reactionaries and revolutionists have been assaulting each other for the past 3 days. I have seen them challenging one another with shouts and songs as if they were going to come to blows right in the middle of the street. This division of opinion will become accentuated when our troops cross the frontier. It will then be civil war. The anti-militarists are clamoring mournfully, believing that it is in the power of the government to prevent the clash. A country degenerated by democracy and by the inferiority of the triumphant Celt, greedy for full liberty. We are the only free people on earth because we know how to obey." This paradox made Julio smile. Germany, the only free people! "It is so," persisted Hartrott energetically. "We have the liberty best suited to a great people, economical and intellectual liberty. And political liberty?" The professor received this question with a scornful shrug. "Political liberty! Only decadent and ungovernable people, inferior races, anxious for equality and democratic confusion, talk about political liberty. We Germans do not need it. We are a nation of masters who recognize the sacredness of government, and we wish to be commanded by those of superior birth. We possess the genius of organization. That, according to the doctor, was the grand German secret, and the Teutonic race, upon taking possession of the world, would share its discovery with all. The nations would then be so organized that each individual would give the maximum of service to society. Humanity, banded in regiments for every class of production, obeying a superior officer, like machines contributing to the greatest possible output of labor. There you have the perfect state. Liberty was a purely negative idea, if not accompanied with a positive concept which would make it useful. The two friends listened with astonishment to this description of the future which Teutonic superiority was offering to the world. Every individual submitted to intensive production, the same as a bit of land from which its owner wishes to get the greatest number of vegetables. Mankind reduced to mechanics, no useless operations that would not produce immediate results. And the people who heralded this awful idea were the very philosophers and idealists who had once given contemplation and reflection the first place in their existence. Hartrott again harked back to the inferiority of their racial enemies. In order to combat successfully, it required self-assurance, an unquenchable confidence in the superiority of their own powers. At this very hour in Berlin, everyone is accepting war. Everyone is believing that victory is sure, while here I do not say that the French are afraid. They have a brave past that galvanizes them at certain times, but they are so depressed that it is easy to guess that they will make almost any sacrifices in order to evade what is coming upon them. The people first will shout with enthusiasm, as it always cheers that which carries it to perdition. The upper classes have no faith in the future. They are keeping quiet, but the presentiment of disaster may easily be conjectured. Yesterday I was talking with your father. He is French and he is rich. He was indignant against the government of his country for involving the nation in the European conflict in order to defend a distant and uninteresting people. He complains of the exalted patriots who have opened the abyss between Germany and France, preventing a reconciliation. He says that Alsace and Lorraine are not worth what a war would cost in men and money. He recognizes our greatness and is convinced that we have progressed so rapidly that the other countries cannot come up to us. And as your father thinks, so do many others. All those who are wrapped in creature comfort and fear to lose it. Believe me, a country that hesitates and fears war is conquered before the first battle. Julio evinced a certain disquietude, as though he would like to cut short the conversation. Just leave my father out of it. He speaks that way today because war is not yet an accomplished fact, and he has to contradict and vent his indignation on whoever comes near him. Tomorrow he will say just the opposite. My father is a Latin." The professor looked at his watch. He must go. There were still many things which he had to do before going to the station. The Germans living in Paris had fled in great bands, as though a secret order had been circulating among them. That afternoon, the last of those who had been living ostensibly in the capital would depart. "I have come to see you because of our family interest, because it was my duty to give you fair warning. You are a foreigner, and nothing holds you here. If you are desirous of witnessing a great historic event, remain. But it will be better for you to go. The war is going to be ruthless, very ruthless, and if Paris attempts resistance as formerly, we shall see terrible things. Modes of offense have greatly changed." Desnoyers made a gesture of indifference. "The same as your father," observed the professor. "Last night he and all your family responded in the same way. Even my mother prefers to remain with her sister, saying that the Germans are very good, very civilized, and there is nothing to apprehend in their triumph." This good opinion seemed to be troubling the doctor. "They don't understand what modern warfare means. They ignore the fact that our generals have studied the art of overcoming the enemy, and they will apply it mercilessly. Ruthlessness is the only means, since it perturbs the intelligence of the enemy, paralyzes his action, and pulverizes his resistance. The more ferocious the war, the more quickly it is concluded. To punish with cruelty is to proceed humanely. Therefore, Germany is going to be cruel, with a cruelty hitherto unseen, in order that the conflict may not be prolonged." He had risen and was standing, cane and straw hat in hand. Argensola was looking at him with frank hostility. The professor, obliged to pass near him, did so with a stiff and disdainful nod. Then he started toward the door, accompanied by his cousin. The farewell was brief. "I repeat my counsel. If you do not like danger, go. It may be that I am mistaken, and that this nation, convinced of the uselessness of defense, may give itself up voluntarily. At any rate, we shall soon see. I shall take great pleasure in returning to Paris when the flag of the Empire is floating over the Eiffel Tower. A mere matter of 3 or 4 weeks, certainly by the beginning of September." France was going to disappear from the map. To the doctor, her death was a foregone conclusion. "Paris will remain," he admitted benevolently. "The French will remain because a nation is not easily suppressed. But they will not retain their former place. We shall govern the world. They will continue to occupy themselves in inventing fashions, in making life agreeable for visiting foreigners, and in the intellectual world we shall encourage them to educate good actresses, to produce entertaining novels, and to write witty comedies. Nothing more. Desnoyers laughed as he shook his cousin's hand, pretending to take his words as a paradox. "I mean it," insisted Hartrott. "The last hour of the French Republic as an important nation has sounded. I have studied it at close range, and it deserves no better fate. License and lack of confidence above, sterile enthusiasm below." Upon turning his head, he again caught Argensola's malicious smile. "We know all about that kind of study," he added aggressively. "We are accustomed to examine the nations of the past, to dissect them fibre by fibre, so that we recognize at a glance the psychology of the living." The Bohemian fancied that he saw a surgeon talking self sufficiently about the mysteries of the will before a corpse. What did this pedantic interpreter of dead documents know about life? When the door closed, he approached his friend, who was returning somewhat dismayed. Argensola no longer considered Dr. Julius von Hartrott crazy. "What a brute!" he exclaimed, throwing up his hands. "And to think that they are at large, these originators of gloomy errors! Who would ever believe that they belonged to the same land that produced Kant, the pacifist, the serene Goethe and Beethoven? To think that for so many years we have believed that they were forming a nation of dreamers and philosophers, occupied in working disinterestedly for all mankind." The sentence of a German geographer recurred to him. The German is bicephalous. With one head he dreams and poetizes, while with the other he thinks and executes. Desnoyers was now beginning to feel depressed at the certainty of war. This professor seemed to him even worse than the Herr Counsellor and the other Germans that he had met on the steamer. His distress was not only because of his selfish thought as to how the catastrophe was going to affect his plans with Marguerite. He was suddenly discovering that in this hour of uncertainty he loved France. He recognized it as his father's native land and the scene of the great revolution. Although he had never mixed in political campaigns, he was a Republican at heart, and had often ridiculed certain of his friends who adored kings and emperors, thinking it a great sign of distinction. Argensola tried to cheer him up. "Who knows? This is a country of surprises. One must see the Frenchman when he tries to remedy his want of foresight. Let that barbarian of a cousin of yours say what he will, there is order, there is enthusiasm. Worse off than we were those who lived in the days before Valmy. Entirely disorganized, their only defense battalions of laborers and countrymen handling a gun for the first time. But nevertheless, the Europe of the old monarchies could not for 20 years free themselves from these improvised warriors." End of Section 21. Recording by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico.